Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So, it's about a week since my last video, and my neighborhood is a medium risk neighborhood. I don't recall if I mentioned that last time, but that, as far as I can tell, that means there has been one case found in my neighborhood so far. So it's not really a dangerous situation for me, but I am nevertheless still staying inside. Um, I do have to go back to work tomorrow, unfortunately, but I'm still going to be working from home, so I'll still be mostly staying inside. As far as reading goes, I don't know. When I first kind of went into the kind of lockdown, social distancing situation back in February, or actually, I guess, late January, now that I think about it, I kind of went into a bit of a reading slump. And to be honest with you, that has sort of come back. I haven't read nearly as much as I was hoping in my week off when I wasn't working and also wasn't able to go out. But I did wind up finishing at least one book, so that's a good thing. Um, so the book that I read is this one here, Travels in Upper Laos and Siam, with an account of the Chinese Ha invasion and Puan resistance by P. Neis. I think I'm pronouncing that name right. I'm not sure. It's French. Uh, this one, it is a 19th century travelogue. Let's see. Let me double check the dates here. Yeah, he the author traveled from Annam, which is today southern Vietnam, around like the Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City area, up the Mekong to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and then across to Thailand, then north into northern Thailand, which at the time was the Lana Kingdom, which I've already talked about in another video, and into Laos, with the final goal of being Luang Prabang, the old royal capital, and still, at least from my experience, the most beautiful city in Southeast Asia. Um, so from there, his plan was to continue north, possibly reaching Yunnan in southern China, and ultimately finishing in what at the time was known as Tonkin, which is essentially northern Vietnam. Uh, this was, of course, a colonial expedition. At the time he left, Annam was firmly in French hands, and the French were engaged in acquiring Tonkin, the northern part of Vietnam, and they had a great deal of interest in expanding their colonial interests in Southeast Asia, and that's why they sent him. But Nice, he's not really a French. He's not a soldier. He's not a bureaucrat. Uh, he's not really, well, at least from his editorial voice and from his writing, he seems much less interested in the politics of French colonial conquest and expansion than he is in just exploring, and that's kind of a refreshing side of it. He was a medical doctor, and I think he used that ability as kind of a way in the door in a lot of cases, where there are several passages here where he comes on a town or village, and someone in the local ruling class has a fever, and so he helps them, and therefore he is accepted immediately. Um, but one of the things that's really interesting with this book is in the sort of subtitle here, with an account of the Chinese Ha invasion and Puan resistance. Um, so this whole area of what's now northern Thailand and Laos, the Lana Kingdom and the Luang Prabang Kingdom, essentially, and the areas immediately to the north of it, what's now the Shan State in Myanmar and the Xishuangbanna area of southern Yunnan in China. this was a very unstable time for this region, because in addition to the colonial powers, the French had already established their footholds in Vietnam and were looking to expand into the region. The British had already conquered Myanmar or Burma and were also looking to expand to the region. But in addition to that, the two most powerful local powers. China was expanding its dominance to extend Yunnan further south, which is why Xishuangbanna even today is uh, is majority Dai people, which Dai and Thai, you can hear the similarities there. That's because they are very, very closely related, and um, especially to the Shan people of Myanmar and to the former Lana kingdom of northern Thailand. And of course, Thailand itself, at the time known as Siam, was also expanding its influence. The Lana kingdom in northern Thailand uh, only really became part of the centralized Thai state at around this time. So this whole region, Laos, northern Thailand, northeastern Myanmar, southern Yunnan, um, this was getting pulled back and forth in four different directions by the British, the French, the Thai, and the Chinese. And it's a really interesting look at uh, at a place that is still today to this day. It's still not the most stable part of the world. It's certainly safe to travel in. I've traveled there quite extensively, but there's still kind of a Borderlands feeling to it. And at the time, it definitely had that. He talks in here at times of uh, attending a water festival when 20 kilometers down the road, there's a war going on. And you get the sense that this is just kind of a normal state of affairs, that the people of this region, because they were on the edge of so many different cultures, so many different civilizations, they were just kind of used to constantly facing these kinds of issues. And even in the pre-colonial era, the you know the Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese, and Burmese peoples would have been competing for dominance in this region. Um, there is a really interesting book, um, and actually not just a book, a kind of a concept in historical geography called Zomia, or also known as Zoasia. And basically, it's the highland region of Southeast Asia. So, northern Thailand, all of Laos, uh, north northern and especially northeastern Myanmar, the highland parts of northwestern Vietnam, the let's see, the southwestern portions of China, such as Yunnan and Guizhou provinces, as well as Guangxi, and I guess you could extend it to Tibet if you really wanted to, and to a certain extent, even the the Seven Sisters, like the northeastern states of India, kind of fall into this as well, as a a borderland region throughout history where the lowland states surrounding it, China, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, uh, constantly compete with each other and with the local people, but never fully control the region. And the book that I mentioned, so that's the concept. The book that I mentioned that is a really interesting one, and I highly recommend it. Although I cannot necessarily speak to its accuracy or to the political slant that it takes, is called "The Art of Not Being Governed." It's in the subtitle is an anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia, because the premise is essentially that these were throughout history essentially stateless regions, that because of their isolation in the highlands and because of the sort of ethnic differences between them and their lowland neighbors, were able, with some exceptions, to mostly maintain their separation from the state systems surrounding them. It's a really interesting book, and like I said, I can't really, I would say take it with a grain of salt, of course, because applying the concept of anarchism to Southeast Asian highland peoples, it's a bit questionable to say the least. But it's an interesting work at any rate. But anyway, back to this one here. So Neis, during his trip, and he spent like 2 years traveling through this region, by the way. So during his trip, he finds himself um, the witness to and caught up in an invasion by the Ha, which he describes as uh, essentially Chinese bandits who are attacking Lao and northern Thai villages. And at one point, he actually very nearly has to take part in the defense of one of these northern Thai villages. And he actually does take part in standing watch. But when the attack comes, he flees because he's a medical doctor. And at the time that he was there, the only other French people in the village were two missionaries. So as he puts it, like two priests and a doctor are not really going to be able to take part in a battle. So he just he runs away, and ultimately the local people from the village also run away as well. But he is able then to expand or to continue his trip. He is ultimately forced to turn back instead of continue on to Tonkin to northern Vietnam because of the danger, because of the fighting between the Chinese, the French, the Vietnamese, the local Lao people, basically just everyone fighting. So he has to turn back and make his way back through Thailand. And unfortunately, that trip, which also includes an excursion to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, is summed up very, very briefly in only about 3 pages, because I'm sure that it would have been really interesting to read about. But nevertheless, it's still definitely an interesting story. As far as his writing goes, um, unfortunately, because of his background, he is a medical doctor. He doesn't have quite the background in things like anthropology or natural style, or excuse me, like biology, or, well, I guess as a doctor he would have a background in biology, but not in like zoology or botany or anything like that, that someone like Alfred Russel Wallace has in his trip. So you kind of miss out on some of the details of the things he sees because he just doesn't have the educational background to expound upon them. But it's still interesting to see it from a foreign perspective. Now, I've mentioned before, I believe I mentioned this in my introduction videos. I read a lot of books from the colonial era, both from colonists like Neis and from the colonized. Uh, and I think that this is really important because this era, the colonial era, um, it's in many ways it's the underpinning for the modern world, uh, for good and for ill. The fact that places like India, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, China are as important as they are today. It well, their importance in some cases comes from their response to colonialism, and so you can take that as a negative or a positive, of course. Of course, colonialism as a whole is 100% a negative. Some of the worst atrocities in the history of mankind happened because of it. But nevertheless, I think it's important to look back on it and to read the sources from it. Again, both from the colonized perspective and from the colonial perspective. And that's one of the reasons that I like books like this. The other reason that I like books like this is that I really love to travel. You know, I've been to about 50 countries, maybe a little more, a little bit less, depending on how you're counting. Um, but one thing that I have noticed in that is that, you know, you can buy a Coca-Cola at a 7-Eleven in almost all 50 of those countries, you know. The A lot of the distinctions and differences between societies have been kind of worn down. And again, there are good aspects to that and bad aspects to that. I'm not making a judgment call on it, but I think it is really interesting to read a book like this where he is genuinely traveling in a place that is completely alien to his experience. And you know, that is just kind of a fascinating experience that unfortunately I know that I'm probably never going to have, no matter how much I do travel. Another reason I like this book in particular, and others like it, is that often they have these incredible wood print or etchings and engravings. This one has a lot of them. Let's see, like interspersed throughout the book, we have black and white engravings like this one that illustrates, you know, a night in the rain on the mountain on a mountainside with little or no shelter. And at two separate points, there are insets of colorized engravings like this one, and they're absolutely gorgeous. I'm particularly a fan of this one here, where this is one of the examples I would say of either Neis misunderstanding or misreading something because of a lack of his educational background here. Um, he at one point he claims that along the river, uh, huge rock formations and trees had been modified in some way to closely resemble animals, both like local animals and also sort of mythological creatures as well. And you can kind of see that here. Like this guy kind of looks like a monkey over here. This one looks like it might be a goat. Here's another one here. And the way he describes it, he says it appears very clear from a distance, but as you get closer, the appearance kind of vanishes. And he says that when he asked the local people about it, they all acted like they didn't know what he was talking about. The way he describes the reaction, it sounds like they're afraid to talk about it, like there's some kind of magical significance to it that you know, makes it taboo to speak of. Um, but I just kind of wonder if maybe he was just imagining things because, you know, it's very possible that he wasn't, but I haven't read anything that similar to this in other sources. So I do kind of wonder if this was just his imagination because he does actually talk about that as a possible explanation. Like maybe I just have too high of a fever when I'm seeing these things. And maybe that's true. But I think that's kind of part of the appeal of travel writing like this is that from an outsider's perspective, um, you might see things that aren't otherwise there. And that kind of lends almost a magic to the landscape that you might not get from someone who actually knows what they're talking about. I know it's a little bit strange to say and to celebrate not knowing what you're talking about, but in this case, I think it's really interesting. As for the book itself, this is a publication of White Lotus Press, which is a publishing house in Bangkok, and they do a lot of English language translations and reprints of you know, books regarding Southeast Asia, both by Southeast Asian authors and by European explorers in the region. And um, I haven't read very many of their books because, as far as I know, you can't really get them outside of Southeast Asia. But all the ones I've seen have been really interesting, and I like them as a publishing house. And if I see one in a used bookstore, I will probably try to pick it up because they're always interesting. Anyway, yeah. French doctor explored Southeast Asia, almost got caught up in a war, and then went back. And that's pretty much it. There's not a whole lot of plot to it, but it's a travelogue. It almost reads more like a diary than anything else, and that's fine. So I think that's going to be it for today. Thank you very much. See you next time.